I have Dusk Leviathans on the brain lately. I know that might seem a little bit odd, seeing how I should be focusing on Amphoreus, and I was, but the more I snoop around this planet, the more I'm starting to suspect it's connected to the Dusk Leviathans. So, you know, I've got Dusk Leviathans on the brain. And some of these coincidences are a little bit obvious, like when the Dusk Leviathans were brought up as an option for the source of the Black Tide back in 3.1. But some of them are a little less obvious. Like, you know how Lygus told us that there's a Lord Ravager trapped upon Amphoreus somewhere? Well, the Lord Ravagers work for Nanook, and Nanook just so happens to have a very weird relationship with Dusk Leviathans. So you can see why I started to investigate this, right? And this video is the result of my investigation, which means the goal of today's theory is to talk about the potential connection between Dusk Leviathans and Amphoreus. But to do that, we not only have to go over everything that we know about the Leviathans and their relationship to Nanook, but we're also gonna have to zoom out a bit and talk about the Leviathans' role on a more universal scale. Which does mean that we're gonna have to spend like 10% of this video talking about Honkai Impact 3rd, because yes, that game is actually important when it comes to unraveling the mystery surrounding Amphoreus and the Dusk Leviathans, and I'm not just saying that, the devs are saying that, so don't blame me for this. I am absolved of all responsibility. That said, the real reason I'm going to spend a little time on Honkai Impact today is because I may or may not have cracked the code to the core of Hoyo's world building across multiple games. Which means that all of the information I'm presenting today will apply to not just Star Rail, although we will be focusing mostly on that, but also to Honkai Impact 3rd and Genshin Impact and maybe more games in the future. I don't know. I'm just recognizing a pattern, and it's a big one, like a whale-sized one. Also, there will be a Genshin Impact version of this video that will explore how the Dusk Leviathan theory applies to a single world rather than the universe at large. So look forward to that. So I hope I have your attention, because we've got a lot to cover, and we're going to kick things off with an overview of what we know about the Leviathans, because we have got to start with the boring stuff before we get to the juicy stuff. And trust me, it does get juicy. So the entities that we know of as Dusk Leviathans in Star Rail are basically these extremely destructive, powerful, massive, and ancient monsters that have been around since the dawn of time. They were known for their voracious appetites, as they would devour the cosmic dust of countless nebula and swallow entire stars whole. They were huge. I'm thinking like Lovecraftian space cosmic horror huge. But this whole process of swallowing the stars shrouded galaxies in a blanket of eternal night, which was devastating to all existing life forms within the cosmos. And so, whatever civilizations were around tried to fight off these harbingers of destruction. And it was likely for that reason that this era was one known only as the Dusk Wars. Because, you know, if a Leviathan swallows all of the light sources in the galaxy, then, you know, their presence would mark the coming of night. Hence, they're Dusk Bringers. Now, very little is known about the Dusk Wars, as what few records that we had were corrupted or obscured by mythos. But what we do know is that these wars obliterated the Leviathan population, perhaps to the point of extinction. I say perhaps because archaeological evidence discovered by the Intelligentsia Guild suggests that there were at least some Leviathans around in the post-Dusk War era, so you know. History continues to be a bit of a mystery. But we also know that as the era of the Leviathans waned, the first eons ascended to bring order and peace to the chaotic post-war universe. The first to ascend, and the eon that matters most to us right now, was Qlipoth, the Preservation. Needless to say, as the first to ascend and one of the few to survive the Dusk Wars, Qlipoth despises the Leviathans, and they have committed themselves to defending the universe against their threat by constructing a, quote, powerful light-years-long seal that would isolate and protect the living worlds. But if you think about it, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because if the Leviathans really went extinct during the Dusk Wars, Qlipoth would have no need for such a wall, because there would be no Leviathans to defend against. Which means that either the Leviathans are still around, or that their return is somehow inevitable. And it turns out, both of these things are true. We know that at least one Leviathan was confirmed to have ascended to Eonhood, and that Leviathan was Ouroboros, the Veracity, who is carrying on the all-devouring nature of the ancient Dusk Leviathans. Qlipoth doesn't really seem that fazed by their presence though, so I can only reason that there must be something about Ouroboros' ascension to Eonhood that makes them no longer Leviathan-like, and therefore not really a recognizable threat to the universe at large. But this would suggest that the real threat is the circumstances through which Leviathans as a species may return to the universe at some point in the future. Now you might be wondering what these hypothetical circumstances might be, and what any of this has to do with Amphoreus. We're gonna get to Amphoreus, I promise, but first I need to introduce you to another potential surviving Leviathan, because they matter to Amphoreus a little bit more than Ouroboros does. And that surviving Leviathan is Long. While I do acknowledge that Ouroboros is the only known Leviathan to ascend to Eonhood, I don't think they're the only Leviathan to ascend. As I implied, I think Long also ascended alongside them. At first glance, this claim makes no sense. I mean, Ouroboros exhibits the all-devouring traits of the Leviathan species, while Long, well, we don't really know much about Long aside from the fact that several noteworthy life forms were born from them, which doesn't seem all that Leviathan-like. Except it is Leviathan-like. In the readable Species of the Galaxy Wubaboo edition, we learn about the Leviathan conception theory, which claims that after the Dusk Wars, elder Leviathans ran aground on planets throughout the universe and fell into a sleep so deep, their bodies began to decompose and their souls began to fracture. Their decomposing bodies became the birthplace of organic life on those planets, and their fragmented souls evolved into astral spirits like the Wubaboo and the Heliobi. Now, this in-game scientific theory is likely why the English translation labels this species as Leviathans, despite their original Chinese name being primordial or ancient beasts, although we're gonna come back to that in a minute. See, the original Leviathan was a sea monster from the Hebrew Bible that was said to devour the souls of the sinners during the apocalypse, and it got its name from the Hebrew word Leviathan, which is also the word used for whale. Now, whales spend their entire lives constantly eating in order to generate enough energy to maintain their large body mass, but when they die, their bodies sink to the bottom of the ocean where they decompose and create complex, localized deep-sea ecosystems. This process is called a whale fall. The decomposing bodies of the deceased whales become the birthplace for new life in the ocean. So these whale falls sure sound a lot like the Leviathan conception theory to me. And they also sound a bit like what happened to Long. In fact, apart from the star-swallowing destruction stuff, Long actually does meet all of the Leviathan criteria. Like, they existed before modern history, perhaps even as far back as the dawn of time, and then they eventually died, and from them came a whole slew of different races like the Vidyadhara, which weirdly fits in with Leviathan conception theory. And actually, if you want to get technical, Tazeroth's path of propagation was one that was split from Long's path of permanence, and their swarm darn near ate the entire cosmos before Qlipoth smashed and sealed them. So that could be related to the whole Leviathan devouring everything thing. Plus, Long is a dragon, and Leviathans are also dragons, both in the Hebrew Bible and in other Hoyo games, like Genshin Impact, for example. Looking at you, humanoid Leviathan sovereign Neuvillette, and also you, all-devouring Narwhal, but we're gonna come back to you specifically in a minute. Well, I say other Hoyo games like it doesn't apply to Star Rail, but it does. Leviathans and whales are dragons in this game too. It's not as obvious, and I don't know if you guys even noticed this, but in the Sanctuary of Long Scions, Scale Gorge Waterscape, it's not only full of the shadows of dragons in the water walls, but these things that are flying around aren't fish, they're whales. Leviathans. Given how this area is supposed to be them parting the seas, it would make more sense if these were fish, but they're definitely not. But the main point I am trying to make here is that I believe both Ouroboros and Long are Leviathans who ascended to Eonhood. And while Ouroboros is exhibiting a destructive num-num state, Long wants to be a mommy. Oh, that changes the context of Tazeroth's baby swaddling form. Ugh. So if I step back to look at the bigger picture of things, I feel like both of these Leviathans turned Eons represent the complete life cycle of the Leviathan species. Ouroboros represents the young Leviathans that eat in order to grow, and once they reach full maturity, they become like Long and experience whalefall and become the nexus for new life. And if I had to wager a guess, I think this process might be cyclical and is, in fact, indicative of a cosmic day-night cycle. Think of it like this. Young Leviathans devour the light of the stars, which means that they are the dusk that heralds the coming darkness of night within the universe, while dying Leviathans release all the light that they consumed back into the universe, therefore becoming the dawn, the light bringers that mark the beginning of a new day. In other words, Leviathans both destroy the universe and seed the universe with life, and they just might be the means by which the universe maintains itself. And I say that because Leviathans are dragons, and dragons are manifestations of nature. At least they are when they're viewed through the lens of Chinese mythology, and that does seem to be in line with how Hoyo treats dragons in general, so I think it's a pretty safe assumption here. But as manifestations of nature, it would also be reasonable to assume that dragons may appear in dead or dying regions of the universe and feast upon whatever decaying matter is around them and recycle it into fresh substances within their bodies. This would be the cycle of life in the universe. The dawn phase Leviathans grant life and distribute matter like they're the Big Bang, while dusk phase Leviathans consume everything in sight and fuse together until they reach a point of singularity, a great contraction. I think I'm beating this horse to death, but let's hit it one more time for clarity, because I am suggesting that Leviathans naturally appear whenever and wherever there is raw matter in need of recycling, which means it might be dead, dying, or decaying matter, which means that the presence of a dusk phase Leviathan is an indication that part of the universe is dying. So a swarm of Leviathans would suggest that the entire universe is about to be completely recycled and reborn, and obviously destroyed in the process. And that could be why Qlipoth hates the Leviathans. Qlipoth wishes to preserve the world in its current form and are thereby denying the universe its right to cosmic recycling. And that's why Nanook entered the chat. As the Aeon of Destruction, it is very easy to see how Nanook is naturally at odds with Qlipoth. One seeks to destroy the universe, and the other seeks to preserve it. But I didn't quite realize just how at odds these two eons are until I noticed how a lot of Nanook's followers, emanators, and forces are either made from, born of, or leverage the power of Dusk Phase Leviathans. You know, Qlipoth's greatest enemy. Ventilia, for example. She's a Heliobe that was formed by fusing a ton of other Heliobe together. That's something Heliobe can do naturally, but she's a particularly noteworthy case as an emanator of destruction and also a Lord Ravager. And remember, Heliobe are born from the souls of the dead Leviathans, which means that their ability to fuse into greater life forms might have something to do with the whole reincarnation of Leviathan sort of thing, but that's not really what I want to focus on right now. And then we have the Doomsday Beast that we fought way back at the very start of the game. This thing was actually formed from the remains of a Leviathan and the bones of countless other dead life forms, which technically makes this thing a zombie dragon. And that's also the case with the Void Rangers. In fact, it's possible that anything made in Nanook's Warforge contains some amount of raw Leviathan remains. And this made me wonder if Nanook actually ascended with the intention of taking on the role of the Dusk Phase Leviathans. Like, what if they looked at the world burning around them and saw nothing worth preserving and thus decided that Qlipoth was wrong to try and preserve the universe in its current state? What if Nanook came to the conclusion that the work of the Dusk Leviathans should be carried out? Everything should be destroyed and devoured so new life can emerge. The ground must be tilled before fresh seeds can be sown. Now, if this feels like an odd take on the path of destruction, then you should really check out this video I made on Nanook and the Stellarons, because I reached a similar conclusion there about Nanook being a sort of, cosmic tractor. You know, tilling the land in preparation for planting, and the Stellarons would be the seeds in this case. Which is fitting because when painted in that light, they're quite similar to like artificial Leviathan cores or souls. Like they're trying to seed the universe the way the Leviathans would. And if you're wondering why I'm making that connection again, it's also because the Leviathan's souls turn into astral spirits like the Heliobe, and the Heliobe are also called Starfire Essence, and Stellarons are likewise named after stars, which also might be why Genshin's all-devouring narwhal is called a star beast. And if that's true, it would certainly explain why a lot of Stellarons have wills and voices, and why their presence on planets reshapes entire landscapes via the fragmentum, mimicking Leviathan souls, or maybe they are Leviathan souls, I don't know. The possibilities are endless. But speaking of Genshin's all-devouring narwhal, let's talk about our little buddy here for a second, because this thing is almost certainly a baby Leviathan. I mean, it's a whale and it devours the primordial sea, which is literally a sea of stars from which life in Teyvat was created. Now, those connections are pretty obvious if you have any surface level knowledge of Genshin at all, but I would add that in Nymph's Dream, which is an artifact set, this narwhal consuming the primordial sea of starry creation juice is actually described like this. The star beasts shall drink the amniotic fluid of the world dry. 100 years from then, all life on its surface shall be wiped away. I will surely return to save all souls. 10 years, even 100 years may pass, but I shall be reborn as a new universe. The first part sounds exactly like a Dusk Phase Leviathan, but the second part was actually written from the perspective of a human who wanted to perform the role of the Dawn Phase Leviathan, which is actually very on point thematically with what's going on in Amphoreus, at least if we assume that the Flame Chase journey is one where the Flame Chasers, or perhaps just Phynon, are trying to become a proxy for the Dawn Leviathan and create a world in the place of their fallen Whale Lord. That said, there must be something blocking blocking the Dawn Leviathan from performing Genesis during Whalefall. Otherwise, there's no reason why a normal person or group of people would ever try to take on that burden of performing Genesis for themselves. Now, I think, as far as Star Rail's greater universe goes, this stasis enforcer is Qlipoth, because Qlipoth wants to preserve the universe in its current state no matter what cost, and they thereby deny the universe its right to, be cosmically recycled. But that's on a very macro scale. If we think of Amphoreus as a microcosm of this phenomenon within the universe, meaning it is showcasing what happens to the universe but on a much smaller scale, then there should be some kind of force holding the world in stasis as well. And that force is likely the seal on the Lord Ravager. Why the seal? Well, because the Lord Ravager is a rampaging force of destruction, same as the Dusk Leviathans. So the seal on the Lord Ravager is like Qlipoth trying to prevent the Leviathans from awakening. Makes sense, right? But if we are pursuing Genesis, then stasis has to be destroyed. That's just the way it is. And that's where Nanook comes into play. Nanook is essentially an eon-shaped proxy for the Leviathan's destruction, a force that fights against the will of preservation and stasis. A claim that I will prove momentarily. But following this logic, if the Lord Ravager of Amphoreus is akin to a Leviathan unable to carry out the act of creation or destruction while sealed, then the Flame Reaver would be its proxy. It's Nanook. But I digress. The point is that if Leviathans are the universe's way of renewing itself in a cycle of creation and destruction, then Nanook is a sort of proxy for the missing Dusk Leviathans that were wiped out in the Dusk War. And that is why they use the remains of Leviathans to forge creatures and weapons of cosmic destruction. And with that said, we finally have all of the pieces that we need to talk about Amphoreus. Although I do have to apologize in advance because we actually do have to talk about Amphoreus and Honkai Impact 3rd at the same time. Again, don't blame me, blame the devs. They're the ones who wanted to base Amphoreus on a very specific Honkai Impact story arc, not me. I'm not to blame here. But okay, the story arc in question is called the Elysian Realm, which is actually a pun. It's a reference to the character Elysia, since this story is basically about her, and it's also a reference to one of the underworlds in Greek mythology, the Elysian Fields. Elysia should look a little familiar even if you haven't played Honkai Impact, because Cyrene is based on her, so it's no coincidence that her hometown is called Idis Elysiae. It's a pretty explicit callback here, and it's a very, very important one too. But to understand that, you're gonna need a little bit of context, and I'm gonna oversimplify this a lot, so just bear with me. So the story of the Elysian Realm is one that tells of a group of 13 heroes known as Flame Chasers, which should sound familiar. And these Flame Chasers are trying to save the world by defeating a giant cosmic horror in the sky known as the Cocoon of Finality. Not to be confused with Star Rail's Eon of Finality terminus, although I will explore that connection at the end of the video. The Cocoon of Finality is not exactly hostile on its own, but its presence alters the imaginary energy within its general vicinity. Now, in case you forgot or didn't know, imaginary energy is what makes up basically everything in both Honkai Impact, Honkai Star Rail, and presumably Genshin Impact, although that last one still needs to be proven. But imaginary energy altered by finality is also known as Honkai. So if you hear the word Honkai anywhere, it is just referring to stuff impacted by this altered imaginary energy. Well, specifically the imaginary energy that the Cocoon of Finality has tampered with. For example, the Honkai beasts that appear all over the world and cause mass destruction are really just creatures made from this altered imaginary energy. We're going to come back to them a little bit later, so keep them in mind. Now, the goal of finality is to embrace humanity, which basically means it wants to kind of like fuse with them or grant them each a piece of itself. Don't think about that too deeply. It gets really difficult to explain without more context. But the main point here is that humanity isn't strong enough to withstand this assimilation, so finality creates these humanoid agents at regular intervals to test if humanity is ready. They're usually not, and the world ends up getting destroyed before the embrace can happen, and then the world gets reset so they can try again. Now, these agents of finality, also known as Hershers, boast their own unique domains of authority similar to the authorities that the Titans get from their core flames. The agents also have cores, so it's a pretty simple one-to-one comparison when you really sit down and think about it. And all of that was really important to explain because our focus here is on Elysia, and Elysia just so happened to be one of these agents of finality. But what made Elysia special and different was that she had no desire to test humanity in such a destructive way. In fact, her story was all about sacrificing herself in order to give humanity a chance to use the power of finality's agents to fight back against finality. Well, what she really wanted was just for humanity to have a better chance at a future, but The details of history get a little bit murky. Now, seeing as the developers have explicitly marked Amphoreus as a retelling or reimagination of this story, it is only right to draw parallels between Elysia and Cyrene. So if Elysia was born an agent of destruction, it is only fitting that Cyrene is also an agent of destruction, or in this case, a Lord Ravager of Nanook. Now remember, Nanook likes to make his Ravagers and armies from the remains of Leviathans, which also means the likelihood of Cyrene being a Leviathan, or at least being made of a bunch of different parts of Leviathans, is quite high. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to assume that regardless of whether Cyrene is a Leviathan or just made from Leviathan parts, that she's going to behave more or less like I would expect a Leviathan to. And if we follow this logic, then Cyrene would logically be the mystical 13th Titan, the hypothetical mother of the other 12 Titans. This is something that we see alluded to in the numerophile texts. These texts suggest that the 12 Titans are actually controlled by the 13th, or to interpret it another way, that the 12 Titans could each represent an aspect or possess a fragment of the 13th's complete authority over the world at large. Assuming this is true, and assuming that Cyrene is both the 13th Titan and a Leviathan, and also a Lord Ravager, then the core flames used to inherit the Titan authorities might just be fragments of Cyrene's soul. Kind of like how Leviathan souls split into astral spirits, which would also mean that Amphoreus itself is born of or from her. It may even be the case that she, like the other mature Leviathans, fell into a deep sleep, and Amphoreus is a world born of her dreams, and that she sacrificed herself in order for that dream to become real eventually. This would be the miracle of creation, of Genesis. The world would basically be born from what remains of her physical Leviathan form, a true whale fall. Now, I would assume that a Dawn Phase Leviathan such as this would be able to perform Genesis on their own. However, I think Cyrene was discovered by or forged at the hands of Nanook, who wanted to exploit her destructive potential instead, maybe even going so far as to augment her with mechanical parts, kind of like the Doomsday Leviathan and its antimatter engine. This digital augmentation could explain some of the more, digital-looking aspects of Amphoreus, as well as tie it back to one of my original theories about Amphoreus, which you can watch here because I'm not going to explain it right now. And this destructive potential could be represented by the Black Tide's spread. And based on her behavior in Phinon's flashbacks and her association with prophecies a la tarot cards, I think Cyrene knew that she probably didn't have a whole lot of time before she succumbed to her destructive nature and the Black Tide took over. But I also believe that Cyrene, like Elysia, sacrificed herself so that humanity inside of her would have a chance to be born with the coming dawn she prophesized. And that sacrifice resulted in the splitting of her soul and the creation of 12 core flames. And this would be how she passed on her power of Genesis and creation onto her creations. But only one core flame could actually bring the dawn and initiate Genesis. This would be the core of Kefali. Because Kefali is the world-bearing Titan. They bear the fate of the entire world on their shoulders, and that is represented by the Dawn device. And the inheritor of Kefali's core flame happens to be Phinon, as prophesized by Cyrene. She handpicked him for this job, which is extremely convenient for me because Phinon is based on another Honkai Impact character named Kevin, who had a very close relationship with Elysia, who Cyrene is based off of. In fact, Kevin was the only one who knew of her plan to sacrifice herself to begin with, and he even kept it a secret, even if it meant lying and telling everyone else that he killed her. And this is very important because we know that the Flame Reaver is also Phinon, and the Flame Reaver is also the one who allegedly killed Cyrene, the same way Kevin allegedly killed Elysia. And after Elysia's death, Kevin continued to carry out her will to create a future where humanity has the power to protect itself from finality. And based on that relationship, if Cyrene is following in Elysia's footsteps and is also a Leviathan, and Phinon is carrying out her will of creating a new future for humanity through the miracle of Genesis, then Phinon is essentially Nanook. Because remember, Nanook is carrying out the unfinished work of the Dusk Leviathans, and Phinon would be carrying out the will of a Leviathan here, and doing so in a very destructive way. But you might be wondering at this point, if Phinon is supposed to be like Kevin and carry out the will of Elysia or Cyrene, then what's the deal with the Flame Reaver? Isn't the Flame Reaver trying to stop the miracle of Genesis? Because that kind of seems like what's happening to me. And that does seem to be a little bit at odds with the idea of Kevin and Phinon trying to save the world, as per Elysia and Cyrene's last wishes. But believe it or not, this is actually super in character for Kevin, which means it should also be in character for Phinon. Because see, after 50,000 years of watching humanity almighty struggle against finality, Kevin had finally had enough and decided that he was just gonna fuse all of humanity into some giant, collective consciousness. He basically became the villain for a while. He was also a bringer of destruction, but he did have the ultimate goal of creation in mind. Just, creation with massive sacrifices. We can probably assume that the Flame Reaver is in a similar situation, because not only do they tell people to return to the Great Dream when they fight them, like Kevin's big dreamy collective consciousness being thing, but the Reaver's use of the Black Tide is also gonna cause major sacrifices. But the funniest thing about these connections to me is that not only does villain Kevin take on this draconic appearance, but he also seizes control of finality for a short period of time. And he uses that power to take the entirety of Earth's history and fuse it into a Honkai beast. And I don't know about you, but that really does sound like an artificially made Leviathan to me. You know, all source material compressed into a singular entity with the intention to use it to rebirth the world later. And before I forget, this worldly beast that he made is using the exact same terminology as the Doomsday Beast. And as you might recall, Leviathans were called primordial beasts in Chinese, which also means that Honkai beasts are kind of like tiny Leviathans. And that could explain why one of the worldly beast's moves is straight up called Leviathan's Break, while the rest are referencing different eras or extinction events. So as you can see, it is actually very appropriate for Finon to eventually become the Flame Reaver and try to dissolve the world via the Black Tide, which might be representative of the Dusk Leviathan's destructive power. And even if the Flame Reaver didn't intend to be the villain, it is very possible that he is acting like Nanook and plowing the land so he can plant the core flame seeds for himself. And who knows why he's doing it, like maybe he's trying to restore Cyrene to her true form. Perhaps he's realized that she's trapped inside some kind of seal and they'll never be reborn unless they break it. Or perhaps he's lost faith in humanity and wants to try and override the system, so to speak. I don't really think the motivation matters for right now, to be honest. Although there is something kind of funny about this relationship between Kevin and Alicia, like with regards to their variants of Finon and Cyrene and their roles within Amphoreus. Because see, Kevin and the other 13 Flame Chasers had all been spliced with different ultra-powerful Honkai beasts, and his happened to be codenamed Brahma, you know, after the Hindu god of creation. Now, Brahma isn't really associated with destruction, so the connection to the Flame Reaver might not make much sense. But Brahma is associated with kalpas, or cycles. And if Amphoreus is experiencing cycles and Finon wants to put an end to the cycles, then, well, you know, that checks out. Plus, Brahma is credited with creating humans, and so is Kefali. Likewise, Alicia had also been spliced with a Honkai beast, and its codename was Shiva, named after the Hindu god of destruction. And Shiva is a really interesting choice here because in the Trimurti, Shiva actually takes on the role more akin to a transformer, as in not someone who only destroys, but someone who changes things from one form to another, which is a perfect fit for a Leviathan who performs the role of creator, destroyer, and transformer. And Shiva is also considered the god of time, something I think Hoyo is making reference to via Mem. Because you know, Mem is the memo sprite of the Trailblazer who inherits the core flame of time. Now, obviously, I'm linking Mem to Cyrene and Alicia for visual reasons, and also because the way that they speak is nearly identical, but there is a lot more to Mem than just superficial coincidences. Take her name, for example. While I don't know if this actually holds up in Chinese, I'm not knowledgeable enough, the name Mem in English has a few possible allusions. One is the obvious one. Mem might be for memory or even memo sprite. But less obvious is the Hebrew letter Mem, which I think might be an intentional localization choice. Because see, within the Hebrew Bible, language is considered the magic of God, and it's how God created the world. He literally spoke it into existence. Therefore, every letter in the Hebrew alphabet has some power of creation in it, and the letter Mem is no exception. The letter Mem bears the meanings of people, nations, and languages, and all of them together totally play into Mem's power over memory and solidify her connection to the book as I've written, because you know, you would write in a language, and you would write about people and nations and stuff. But in addition to this, Mem also refers to waters, waves, and sometimes oceans of knowledge. And we just so happen to have oceans of knowledge in Star Rail in the form of Memoria, because it's memory water. And I think I've mentioned this before, but Amphoreus actually gets its name from the Greek amphore, which is a jar used to hold valuable liquids. But because of their frequent use in rituals and ceremonies, especially funeral rites, amphora saw frequent use as urns or grave markers. So if Cyrene is a dead Leviathan, Leviathan, this name is very appropriate, especially if we consider Amphoreus to be a jar containing memoria. And not just memoria, but the memoria of a Leviathan sealed in a jar. This idea could actually explain why Penacony, a world that's made of memoria, has a lot of memoria whales just hanging around everywhere. Maybe all the missing Leviathans have been reduced to just their memories. Maybe that's why the vortex of Genesis is liquid, and also somehow the entrance to Amphoreus, which is also governed by Phagusa, who controls the ocean. Maybe the miracle of Genesis is just popping the cork on the amphora. Also, Phynon in Cyrene's hometown is called Idis Elysia, which is indeed a callback to Elysia, but the term Idis means either temple or tomb, and that totally fits in with the whole Amphore gravestone idea. It's the temple or tomb of Elysia, or Cyrene in this case. But this does make me wonder if Idis Elysia is the location where the Leviathan Cyrene's consciousness was entombed, or if Idis Elysia was never a real place at all. Hear me out. You remember how I compared the fractured souls of the Dawn Leviathans to Stellarons? Well, what if Amphoreus really does have a Stellaron on it, and that Stellaron is the core or soul of Leviathan Cyrene? Because as I touched on earlier, Stellarons and Leviathans transform worlds, Stellarons via the Fragmentum, and Leviathans through the loss of their physical and spiritual form. Although who knows, maybe the Fragmentum is actually a Leviathan power. Because just as the Stellaron has a voice or a will of its own, so too should the souls of a Leviathan, right? And I do think a star beast should possess a star-like core. Plus, if we look at Cyrene as a Leviathan in the same way that we look at Elysia as a creation of a similar cosmic horror, a la finality, then it does make sense how Elysia's connection to Shiva, the creation, destruction, and transformation deity, could also apply to Cyrene. And if this is the case, if the Stellaron is what is left of Cyrene, then Phynon might be like Cocolia. He might be the one who hears the voice of the Stellaron, of Cyrene. I mean, for all we know, Phynon's whole backstory could just be a fabrication that came from his interactions with the Stellaron. Or maybe the Dawn device really is the Stellaron, and Kephaly symbolically bears its weight on its back because he's carrying the will of Cyrene. Literally. But if the Dawn device or Stellaron is the core of Cyrene, then what's the deal with Mem? Technically speaking, Mem is a memory construct that was allowed to manifest thanks to Orynyx's authority over time, which hypothetically should have been a fragment of Cyrene's power. So Mem might be more of how Orynyx remembers Cyrene, or perhaps how Cyrene has chosen to reimagine herself. A form that is both recognizable, but also not recognizable. And if that's true, it's quite curious because Mem bears a striking resemblance to Pom Pom. And that's suspicious because the Astral Express has whales, Leviathans, on its ceiling. Leviathan imagery on a train Pom Pom can't leave, and a striking resemblance to the manifestation of an alleged Leviathan. What secrets are you hiding, Pom Pom? That's perhaps an investigation for another day, but for now, let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how much March 7th loves Pom Pom? She has giant plushies of him, and in her base kit design, she even attacks with tiny frozen Pom Pom looking creatures. Now I admit that this affection makes sense considering March woke up on the Express with no memories, and it would be easy to see how she'd grow fond of the first things that she saw, and among those would be Pom Pom. But given the minor similarities between the designs of Mem, Cyrene, and March, and the fact that March's proximity to Amphoreus forced her into a state of hibernation so severe that she might lose her ability to remember anything at all, I started to wonder something. You know how I talked about how Cyrene and Elysia would have both sacrificed themselves for the good of humanity's future? And how, in Cyrene's case, she would have split herself into 12 pieces, which would have then become the core flames the Titans had? Well, I'm starting to wonder if she didn't split herself into 12 pieces, but 13 pieces. But either by design or by accident, I wonder if one of those pieces escaped Amphoreus' orbit and drifted off into space. And then the Astral Express stumbled upon it. That's right, I'm suggesting that March 7th might be the 13th fragment of Cyrene, who escaped Amphoreus and floated into space in this big ice crystal for who knows how long. And we know she isn't just frozen in any kind of ice, she's frozen in 6-phase ice, which is in some weird way similar to the process of dream weaving, which would easily tie back to the idea that in Leviathan conception theory, the Leviathans that are dying in the whale fall into a deep slumber and potentially dream up entire worlds that they then somehow create with their decomposing bodies and souls. Is that a coincidence? I'm not convinced. You know, I actually tried to get this out in time for 3.2's maintenance, but miscalculated exactly how much time I had and I did not make it. I'm kind of glad though, because that gave me time to have some great conversations with KitKat, who helped me flesh out a lot of the weaker ideas here and also fill in some blanks on some Honkai Impact stuff, so that was cool. Now, I'm sure you've realized this on your own, but there is a lot of stuff that this whole Leviathan whalefall theory recontextualizes, but there are two things in particular that I'm interested in sharing with you guys while my enablers bask in the glow of whatever this crazy thing I've concocted is. Here's the first thing. In the Genshin theory community, there is a very popular theory that any character who has pointy ears has to be a dragon or of draconic lineage. Now, this was a mostly vibe-based theory until a confirmed human-shaped dragon, mostly Nouvelette, released with very pointy ears. Not the super long kind that we were talking about, but still pointy. Now, I by no means have, like, definitive proof of this, but I did recently learn that the term eldritch means elf-like, which struck me as kind of odd because we typically use it to refer to, like, Lovecraftian cosmic horror beasts, like creatures from the abyss, deep space alien entities that we don't understand. Those are eldritch horrors. But if these unknowable cosmic monsters are actually more like leviathans, then perhaps this is evidence to suggest that dragons, when human-shaped at least, obtain elven-like traits, such as pointy ears. This would certainly explain Alicia's long pointy ears and even Kevin's long pointy ears when he is in his draconic form, and that would also fit with Star Rail's Vidyadhara, who are defined by their pointy ears. And if this remains even somewhat consistent across Hoyoverse's games, then we may want to reevaluate the rest of the pointy-eared cast members. For Genshin, it would be like Klee and Nahida and Layla, but in Star Rail, that would mean Tribby. Tribby would be very interesting because not only does she have a lot in common with Nahida, but her role within Amphoreus is kind of similar to the role of Akavili in the greater Star Rail universe. And Akavili has Leviathans on the roof of the Astral Express, so maybe there is a connection there. Maybe Pom Pom is related to Leviathans. I don't really know, but it's food for thought, don't you think? I also think that this whalefall hypothesis could be the way that Hoyo intends to connect their games together without actually connecting them. Like each Dawn Leviathan would dream up a new world which allows it to have its own mechanics and history and all that kind of stuff. I just really like the idea of playing around with a whalefall, especially with all of the pieces kind of popping up and starting to click together, you know what I mean? But that's it, I think I'm done. So thank you all so much for watching. I need to go lie down. My brain's swimming so much I kind of feel like a fish. Just keep swimming, just keep swimming.